Emily stood by the window, watching as the sky darkened with an ominous hue. The weather forecast had predicted a storm, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The clouds gathered like an army in the sky, thick and swirling, tinged with a sickly green that made her stomach churn. The wind was picking up, carrying with it a strange, almost electric charge. It felt like something was brewing, something more than just a storm. She shivered and stepped back from the window, pulling the heavy velvet drapes closed. The house was old, too old, really, and its creaks and groans made her uneasy. Emily had never felt truly comfortable here, not even as a child when her grandmother used to bring her for summer visits. Now that the house was hers, the feeling of dread had only intensified. It was as though the walls were holding secrets, whispering things just out of earshot. The inheritance had come suddenly. One moment, her grandmother was lively and full of stories, and the next, she was gone, leaving Emily with a house she had never wanted. Her parents had passed years before, so Emily was alone in the world. Now, all that remained was this sprawling, isolated Victorian mansion perched at the edge of the woods. Emily sighed, pushing thoughts of her grandmother's death aside. It had been too much to process at once, her grief, the estate, and the memories of this strange, haunting place. She tried to distract herself, focusing on the present task, settling in for her first night alone. She had spent the day unpacking the few belongings she had brought with her, but the house still felt empty, echoing with the absence of its former occupant. Outside, the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, vibrating through the floorboards under her feet. The sound was distant at first, but there was something about it that made Emily's skin prickle. She had always hated thunderstorms, though she had never really understood why. There was no traumatic memory associated with them, no logical reason for her fear. Still, they had always left her feeling anxious, unsettled. A loud crack of thunder jolted her from her thoughts, and she gasped involuntarily, her heart racing. The storm was getting closer, and with it, a strange heaviness began to settle over the house. Emily tried to shake it off, reasoning that it was just the old structure reacting to the changing weather, but the feeling lingered, making her feel as though something was pressing down on her, watching her from the shadows. She moved through the house, checking the windows to make sure they were all closed. The wind had begun to howl now, rattling the panes and sending gusts through the cracks in the old wooden frames. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she made her way to the kitchen, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent house. She told herself she was being silly, that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But even as she thought it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Another clap of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered. Emily froze, her heart thumping in her chest. The power stayed on for now, but the storm was only just beginning. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the hallway. It was nearly midnight. She hadn't realized how late it had gotten. With a sigh, Emily grabbed a glass of water and headed for the stairs. She told herself she just needed sleep, that the tension in her chest would ease once she rested. But as she ascended the staircase, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. A soft, almost imperceptible creak, as though someone was standing just behind her. Emily turned, shining her flashlight down the stairwell. Nothing. She tried to calm her breathing, but the silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. She shook her head and continued upward, telling herself she was just tired and jumpy. Yet, with every step she took, she felt that invisible weight growing heavier, as though some unseen force was bearing down on her. When she reached the landing, she paused for a moment, her hand resting on the banister. She had the sudden, unsettling feeling that if she turned around now, she might see something, or someone, standing there. She resisted the urge, forcing herself to focus on getting to her room. But as she turned toward the hallway, she thought she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow flitting across the wall at the far end of the corridor. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the shadow had looked like a person. But when she turned her head fully, there was nothing there, just the empty hallway and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Emily quickened her pace, almost running the last few steps to her bedroom. She shut the door behind her with a shaky hand, turning the lock with a soft click. Safe inside, she leaned against the door, trying to collect herself. The wind outside howled louder now, and the storm was in full force. The power flickered again, and this time it didn't come back. Her bedroom was plunged into darkness, save for the faint light of her flashlight, which she clutched like a lifeline. She lit a few candles around the room, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the walls. Emily couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been growing since the storm began. The house seemed different now, darker and more oppressive, as though something had awakened with the thunder. She tried to distract herself by picking up one of the old books she had found in her grandmother's study. It was a collection of local legends and ghost stories, the kind of thing her grandmother had always loved. Emily hadn't thought much of it at first, just another piece of the house's strange history. But now, as she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. One of the stories was about a house, much like her grandmother's, that had stood for centuries at the edge of the woods. According to the tale, the house was cursed, its inhabitants driven mad by the spirits that lingered within its walls. They said the house had a will of its own, that it fed on fear, drawing its occupants deeper into its twisted embrace. Emily shuddered, closing the book abruptly. She knew it was just a story, just a piece of folklore meant to scare children. But as the storm raged outside and the shadows grew longer, she couldn't help but feel that there was some truth to it. The house felt alive tonight, its presence wrapping around her like the storm itself, suffocating and relentless. She climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room, watching the flickering shadows dance across the walls. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the storm was playing tricks on her senses. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong here, something she couldn't quite explain. And as the thunder rolled once more, shaking the very foundation of the house, Emily knew that whatever it was just getting started. Emily sat upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest as the storm raged outside. The power had gone out almost an hour ago, plunging the house into complete darkness. The wind howled fiercely, rattling the old windows in their frames, while the thunder cracked so loudly it felt like the very foundation of the house was shaking. She wrapped the blankets tighter around her, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had been gnawing at her ever since she arrived. But it wasn't just the storm outside that unsettled her now. It was something else, something inside the house. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it in the air, a heaviness that pressed against her skin, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was as though the air had thickened, filled with a presence she couldn't see but could feel, lurking in every shadow, in every corner. Her grandmother's house had always been strange, but tonight it felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Emily kept telling herself it was her imagination, that it was just an old house creaking and groaning in the storm, but the feeling persisted, stubborn and unrelenting. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It had stopped, its hands frozen at 12:01, a few minutes after the power had gone out. Emily shifted uncomfortably, the candlelight casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. She told herself to stop being ridiculous. There was nothing here, nothing but her and her overactive imagination. But then she heard it, a faint creak just outside her bedroom door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the door, her mind racing. The logical part of her knew it could be the house settling or the wind pushing against the walls, but the part of her that had been raised on ghost stories couldn't help but wonder if something else was out there. She swallowed hard, listening intently. Another creak, this one closer. Emily felt a wave of cold wash over her. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, every instinct screaming at her to stay put, to not open the door. But curiosity won out over fear. Slowly, she rose from the bed, her legs trembling as she approached the door. She grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, its weak beam cutting through the darkness as she edged closer. The door loomed before her, its old wood worn and faded from years of use. For a moment, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. What if there was something on the other side? What if she wasn't alone in this house after all? She could feel her pulse quicken, her breathing shallow and uneven. Gathering her courage, she slowly turned the knob, the door creaking open with an agonizingly loud groan. Emily winced at the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she peered out into the hallway. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the old worn wallpaper and the dusty floorboards. She took a deep breath and stepped into the hall, her footsteps soft but echoing in the silence. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional gust of wind. The air felt colder out here, and the oppressive heaviness she had felt in her room seemed to intensify. She swept the flashlight down the length of the hallway, her heart skipping a beat when the light landed on the far end. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing there, a dark shape, tall and still, watching her. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat as she pointed the flashlight directly at the spot. The beam wavered as her hands shook, but the figure was gone. Emily's heart raced as she backed up a step, her mind whirling. Had she imagined it? Was the storm playing tricks on her eyes? Or was there really someone or something there? The silence pressed down on her, growing heavier with every passing second. Emily forced herself to move, her feet carrying her down the hallway, her body trembling with each step. She didn't know where she was going, but she felt compelled to keep moving, as though staying still would somehow make things worse. She reached the stairs and stopped, peering down into the darkness below. The living room stretched out beneath her, its shadowy corners now cloaked in pitch black. She took a tentative step down the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath her weight. She winced at the noise, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. She had only made it halfway down the staircase when another sound reached her ears, a soft whisper, almost too quiet to hear. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she strained to listen. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as though it were coming from right beside her. "Emily." Her blood ran cold. She turned abruptly, shining the flashlight behind her, but there was nothing there. Panic surged through her as she whipped the light around, illuminating every inch of the staircase. But she saw nothing. No one. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, watching her from the darkness just beyond the reach of her light. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Emily backed away from the staircase, her mind racing. She knew she hadn't imagined the voice. It had been real, so real that it had sent a chill down her spine. But there was no one there. She bit her lip, her fingers gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't stay here, frozen in fear. She needed to get out of the house, storm or no storm. As she turned to make her way back down the stairs, another sound stopped her dead in her tracks. A loud, deliberate creak, this time coming from directly above her. She whipped around, pointing the flashlight up toward the landing at the top of the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it. Something dark and tall standing at the edge of the banister, watching her. The beam of light wavered as she stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It was a figure, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as though observing her with curious, hollow eyes. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away slowly, her heart thundering in her chest. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, bearing down on her like a physical force. She had the sudden, terrifying realization that it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real, and it was getting closer. The figure began to move slowly and deliberately, its form blending into the shadows as it descended the stairs. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as panic gripped her. She turned and bolted down the rest of the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground as she raced for the front door. But when she reached it, she froze. The door was wide open, the storm raging just outside. Rain lashed at the walls and the wind howled with a deafening fury. But it wasn't the storm that made her hesitate. It was what she saw standing just beyond the threshold. Another figure, tall and gaunt, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. Emily's mind reeled as she backed away from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure outside didn't move, but its presence felt even more menacing than the one inside the house. She was trapped, caught between two horrors with no way out. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the oppressive weight of the house bearing down on her like a living thing. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed up against the wall, her mind racing. She was no longer sure what was real and what was a product of her fear, but one thing was certain. The house was no longer just a house. It was alive and it had her trapped in its grasp. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm outside seemed to calm. The howling wind subsided, and the rain softened to a gentle patter. Emily stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes darting between the open door and the dark staircase. She could no longer see the figures, but she could feel them, lurking in the shadows, waiting. She wasn't alone, not anymore. Something had awakened in the house, something that had been lying dormant for years. And now it was watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. But Emily wasn't sure she had the strength to face whatever was lurking in the darkness. Not alone. Not tonight. Emily awoke in the cold, oppressive darkness, her heart pounding in her chest as if it were trying to escape. She had no memory of falling asleep, only of the suffocating fear that had gripped her as she fled from the looming shadows in the house. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by an unseen force that seemed to thicken the air around her. She blinked several times, trying to adjust her eyes to the darkness, but the room remained as black as ink. It took her a moment to realize something was wrong. This wasn't her room. She sat up quickly, her breath catching in her throat. The familiar walls of her grandmother's Victorian house had disappeared, replaced by an unfamiliar space, a place that felt wrong on every level. The dimensions of the room seemed distorted, the walls too close and slanted at impossible angles, as though the house itself had twisted into something foreign, something malevolent. Emily's heart pounded harder. She reached for her flashlight on the nightstand, only there was no nightstand. Her hands brushed against cold, damp wood, slick with moisture. Panic set in as she realized that everything she knew, the bed, the furniture, the familiar textures of the house, had vanished. She was somewhere else, somewhere that defied reason. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. She stumbled toward where the door should have been, only to find nothing but solid, cold wood in its place. She felt along the walls, her fingers tracing over the rough surface, searching for any sign of a doorknob, a latch, anything. But the door was gone. The room had no exit. Emily's breathing grew shallow as she turned in circles, panic overtaking her rational mind. This couldn't be real. Doors didn't just disappear. Rooms didn't change overnight. She tried to remember if she had left her room at all, if she had wandered in her sleep. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind was foggy, her memories jumbled, as though something had tampered with them. She pounded her fists against the walls, the sound echoing in the small space, but the walls didn't budge. There was no answer to her desperate cries, no sign that anyone else could hear her. It was as though she had been swallowed by the house itself, trapped in a space that shouldn't exist. The air grew colder. She shivered, pulling her arms around herself for warmth. The silence pressed down on her like a physical weight, broken only by her own labored breathing. And then, just when she thought she might go mad from the suffocating quiet, she heard it. A soft whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Emily!" She froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It wasn't her own voice or that of a stranger. It was her grandmother's. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She hadn't heard her grandmother's voice in months, not since the funeral, not since she had been left alone in this cursed house. But here it was, echoing softly in the darkness, calling her name. "Emily!" She wanted to scream, to tell the voice to leave her alone, but her throat felt tight as though her fear had taken hold of her vocal cords. She backed away from the sound, her hands trembling as she held them out in front of her like a shield. But there was nowhere to go, no door, no escape. She was trapped with whatever was in this room with her, and it was getting closer. She could feel the air grow colder still, a biting chill that seeped into her bones. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a strange, unsettling sensation. It was as though the walls themselves were shifting around her, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some great, slumbering beast. Emily pressed herself against one of the walls, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound of the voice. It was so complete, so total, that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room entirely. Emily closed her eyes, praying that when she opened them again, everything would be back to normal. But when she finally forced her eyelids open, she saw something that made her heart stop. The room was no longer empty. At first, she couldn't make out the figure standing in the corner. It was little more than a shadow, its form indistinct and shifting, as though it were caught between one reality and another. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to see it more clearly. It was tall, much taller than any person should be, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face, or what passed for a face, was obscured by darkness, but Emily could feel its gaze on her, cold and unblinking. It didn't move, but she could feel it watching her, studying her. She pressed her back harder against the wall, her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't move, and her voice felt trapped in her throat. All she could do was stare at the thing in the corner, praying it wouldn't come any closer. And then, slowly, it began to move. The figure took a single step toward her, its body shifting unnaturally as it did so, like a shadow stretching across a wall. Emily's breath hitched as she watched it, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. She had to get out. She had to escape this nightmare. But the walls were solid, the door was gone, and there was nowhere left to run. The figure took another step, its elongated form drifting closer to her. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself harder against the wall, her mind screaming for her to fight, to flee, to do something, anything. But she was frozen in place, trapped by her own terror. "Emily," the voice whispered again, this time right next to her ear. She gasped and turned, expecting to see the figure looming over her, but there was nothing there. The air was cold, so cold it burned her skin, and the shadows seemed to deepen around her, closing in like a noose. Her chest tightened, and she felt as though the walls themselves were pressing against her, squeezing the air from her lungs. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the pressure suddenly lifted. The walls around her seemed to shimmer for a moment, and then, just as quickly as it had vanished, the door reappeared. It was right in front of her now, solid and real. She stared at it, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The figure was gone. The room was quiet once more. The oppressive atmosphere that had suffocated her moments ago now faded to a distant memory. Emily's legs shook beneath her as she stumbled toward the door, her fingers fumbling with the doorknob. She half expected it to disappear again, to trap her in that hellish space forever. But when she turned the knob, the door opened with a soft creak. She stepped out into the hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she slammed the door shut behind her. The familiar walls of her grandmother's house greeted her, but they no longer felt safe. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hold the threat of something lurking just out of sight. She pressed her back against the door, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She glanced around, half expecting to see the figure standing somewhere in the darkness. But the hallway was empty. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The house was still, too still. Emily pushed away from the door, her legs trembling as she made her way down the hallway. She had no idea what had just happened, whether it had been a nightmare or something far worse. But one thing was certain. The house was no longer just a house. Something had changed. It had come alive, shifting and bending reality in ways that defied explanation. And it wasn't finished with her yet. She could feel it lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to let her guard down, to step into its trap once again. Emily knew she had to get out of the house, but where would she go? The storm outside raged on, and the woods surrounding the estate were dense and foreboding. She was trapped not by walls or locked doors, but by something far more terrifying, an unseen force that had woven itself into the very fabric of the house, and it wanted her. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching her with its hollow eyes. But there was nothing, only shadows. For now. The house was quiet now, as if the storm outside had finally drained it of its malevolent energy. Emily stood in the grand hallway, her back pressed against the old, warped door she had just slammed shut. Her breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. The heavy silence enveloped her, an almost tangible force that seemed to press against her skin. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something sour, something old and rotten that lingered beneath the surface. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, but when she opened them again, the house seemed different. The shadows were deeper, more sinister, crawling along the floor and walls like living things. The edges of the room appeared blurred, as though the house itself were losing definition, breaking down into something else. Her mind churned, refusing to accept what she had seen in that room, but no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, she knew the truth now. The house was alive, and it had always been waiting for her. Emily had inherited more than just her grandmother's old house. She had inherited its curse, its hunger. For as long as she could remember, the house had been a looming presence in her life, an enigma that her grandmother had both revered and feared. The stories her grandmother had told her as a child about spirits, shadows, and things that lived in the walls had always seemed like harmless folklore. But now, in the cold, suffocating grip of reality, Emily understood. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts or memories. It was the ghost. An entity in and of itself, ancient, insidious, and utterly relentless. It didn't just contain darkness, it was darkness. Emily pushed herself off the door, her legs unsteady, and staggered down the hallway toward the parlor. She had to get out. She had to leave before the house claimed her like it had claimed so many others. But as she reached the threshold of the room, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her heart seized in her chest. In the flickering candlelight, her grandmother stood before her. Emily blinked, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't possible. Her grandmother had been dead for months, and yet there she was, standing by the fireplace, her eyes fixed on Emily with a sorrowful expression. She looked exactly as Emily remembered her. Frail but graceful, her silver hair pinned up in loose waves, wearing the same floral dress she had been buried in. "Grandma," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The figure smiled softly, but there was something wrong with the smile, something unsettling. Her grandmother's eyes, once warm and full of life, now appeared empty, devoid of any spark. They were hollow, lifeless. A chill ran down Emily's spine, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, caught between fear and the strange, inexplicable longing to believe this apparition was real. "You've finally come home," her grandmother said, her voice soft and distant, like a memory fading in and out. "The house has been waiting for you, Emily, just like it waited for me." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "What do you mean? Why is this happening? What does the house want?" Her grandmother took a step closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The house doesn't want, it needs. It needs someone to feed it, to sustain it. It thrives on our fear, our pain. It has for generations. We are part of it now, Emily. You can't leave." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I refuse to believe that. There has to be a way out. I'm not going to stay here and die like you did." Her grandmother's face twisted, her expression shifting from sorrow to something darker, something hungry. The soft maternal tone in her voice turned cold. "You don't have a choice, Emily. None of us did. The house chooses who stays and who goes, and it has chosen you. Emily took a step back, her mind reeling. She had to think, had to find a way out. But the walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing longer, darker, until they felt like hands reaching for her, pulling her deeper into the house's embrace. The air grew heavy again, thick with the scent of decay and dampness, and the faint sound of whispering echoed through the halls. It was as if the house was speaking to her, beckoning her to surrender, to give herself up to it. She turned on her heel and ran, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the house. She had no idea where she was going. There was no plan, no clear escape route. Every door she passed felt like a trap, every hallway a maze designed to lead her deeper into the house's belly. But she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with voices she didn't recognize. They called her name over and over again, as if trying to lure her back. Emily clamped her hands over her ears, desperate to block them out, but the voices penetrated her mind like needles, sharp and relentless. Emily. Emily. Suddenly she found herself in front of the door to the basement. It stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it deeper than any she had ever seen. She knew instinctively that this was where the heart of the house lay, its core, its essence. And somehow, she knew that if she went down there, there would be no coming back. But there was no other choice. She had to face it. Emily swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she reached for the doorknob. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, and the voices quieted as if waiting for her to make her decision. She hesitated for only a moment, then pulled the door open wide. The darkness yawned before her, a void that seemed to go on forever. She descended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight, the cold air biting at her skin. The deeper she went, the stronger the pull became, like a magnet drawing her closer to something ancient and unknowable. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was so thick with moisture that she could hardly breathe. And then she saw it. The room at the bottom of the stairs was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls pulsed, alive with a faint, sickly glow that seemed to emanate from deep within the house itself. In the center of the room was an enormous black mass, undulating and shifting as though it were breathing. It was a grotesque organic thing, like the heart of some monstrous creature. It throbbed with life, exuding a sense of malevolent power that made Emily's stomach turn. This was the source. This was what the house had been feeding all along, feeding on fear, on pain, on lives. The lives of her grandmother, of the generations before her, and now it wanted her. "No," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't let you have me." She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the pulsating mass. She had no plan, no weapon, nothing but her will to survive. But she knew that she had to end this. Had to sever the connection between the house and its cursed heart. As she reached the center of the room, the black mass pulsed harder, faster, as if sensing her defiance. The walls trembled, the air crackling with energy. Emily raised her hands, unsure of what she was doing, but knowing she had to do something. She closed her eyes, focusing all of her energy, all of her willpower on one thought. End this. Now. The room exploded with light. Emily was thrown backward, her body slamming into the stone wall behind her. She gasped for breath, her vision blurry as she tried to regain her bearings. The black mass writhed in agony, its form distorting and collapsing in on itself. The house shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering as if it were being torn apart from the inside. For a moment, Emily thought she had done it. She thought she had won. But then the light faded and the darkness returned. The house stilled, the tremors ceased, and the black mass slowly reformed, stronger than before. It pulsed with an even darker energy now, as though it had absorbed her attempt to destroy it and grown more powerful in the process. Emily collapsed to the floor, defeated, tears streaming down her face. There was no escape. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed all the others before her. She could feel it now, the tendrils of darkness wrapping around her soul, binding her to this place for eternity. As her vision dimmed and the last of her strength drained away, she heard the whispering again, soft and insistent. "Welcome home, Emily." And then, there was only darkness. The house stood silent and still, nestled deep in the woods at the edge of town. The storm had passed, leaving only a few stray leaves and broken branches scattered across the lawn. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the property. Inside the house, everything appeared peaceful, just as it always did after the storm. The walls, the floors, the furniture all sat undisturbed, as though nothing had happened. And in the stillness of the parlor, a faint voice could be heard, carried on the wind. "Emily?" The house was waiting. Mia stared at the letter, the paper soft and yellowed with age, as though it had been waiting for her in some dark corner of time. It had arrived without warning, slipped through the mail slot of her apartment door, like any other piece of junk mail. Only this one was different. The envelope bore no return address, just her name, Mia Kensington, written in looping, elegant script that sent a chill down her spine. She had never seen handwriting like this before, and the way the ink bled into the paper suggested it was written with an old-fashioned fountain pen. As she tore open the envelope, a faint scent of earth and mildew wafted up, making her wrinkle her nose. Inside was a single sheet of thick, heavy parchment, with a message so brief it felt ominous. "You are invited to the Halloween haunt. One night only. October 31st, midnight, Hill Ridge Manor. Come alone. Bring nothing but your courage." At first, Mia thought it must be some kind of prank. Halloween was just a few days away, after all, and she was no stranger to the elaborate tricks some people like to play this time of year. But there was something about the letter that made her pause. It wasn't just the age of the paper or the cryptic message. It was the mention of her name. Her full name. She couldn't recall ever telling anyone about Hill Ridge Manor. In fact, she hadn't even thought about that place in years, not since she was a child. She had only been there once, long ago when her mother had taken her on one of her so-called adventures. It was an old, abandoned estate on the outskirts of town, half swallowed by the overgrown woods that surrounded it. The local kids always whispered about the house, calling it haunted, but Mia had never believed them. At least, not until her mother disappeared. The memory of that day, the way her mother had vanished without a trace after wandering too close to the house, still haunted Mia. No one had ever found a body. The police had chalked it up to an accident, but Mia had never truly accepted that explanation. The house had taken her. She was sure of it. Mia shuddered, pushing the thought away as she reread the invitation. Who would send something like this? And why now? She flipped the letter over, searching for some clue, anything that might explain how someone knew about her connection to Hill Ridge Manor. but the back of the parchment was blank except for one final line of text in tiny, precise letters. "We know you're ready." The words made her skin crawl. What was she supposed to be ready for? She didn't want to be ready for anything. Mia had spent the past 10 years trying to forget, trying to move on from the nightmares that plagued her sleep and the guilt that gnawed at her like a festering wound. She didn't want to revisit that place or the memories that came with it. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the letter had been meant for her, that it wasn't just a coincidence or some sick joke. A flash of lightning illuminated the window, casting long, ghostly shadows across the floor of her small apartment. Mia watched the rain begin to beat against the glass, her heart pounding in time with the drops. Maybe this was her chance to find answers, to finally confront the truth about what had happened all those years ago. She had spent too long living in fear, locked inside her own mind, reliving that day in endless loops of terror. Maybe now was the time to face it head on, or maybe it was just another trap. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. The rational part of her knew she should throw the letter away, ignore it, and continue with her life. But there was another part, a darker part, that felt drawn to the invitation, an inexplicable pull toward the unknown, toward the place that had ruined her childhood and stolen her mother. Mia tossed the letter onto her coffee table and stood, pacing the small confines of her living room. Her thoughts raced in circles, spiraling around the same question: why now? As the storm raged on outside, her mind refused to settle. She tried to watch TV, distract herself with something mindless, but every time she glanced at the screen, all she could see was the letter sitting there, taunting her with its presence. Finally, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, she made her decision. Without bothering to pack a bag or grab an umbrella, she slipped on her coat, stuffed the letter into her pocket, and stepped out into the rain. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts were consumed by the looming dread of what she was about to do. Hillridge Manor waited. The drive out to the manor was long and winding, the kind of journey that seemed to stretch on forever as the world outside her car grew darker, more unfamiliar. The rain pelted the windshield, turning the road into a blur of slick black pavement and twisted tree limbs. The deeper she went, the more isolated she felt, as though she were leaving behind the real world and entering a place that existed only in nightmares. When she finally arrived at the gates of Hillridge Manor, her heart stopped. The iron gates stood open as if they had been waiting for her, and beyond them, the house loomed like a great decaying beast. Its windows were dark, its stone walls weathered and cracked, yet there was something almost alive about it, as though the house was watching her, waiting to see what she would do. Mia hesitated for a moment, her breath fogging up the air as she stared at the mansion. A part of her wanted to turn around, drive back to the safety of her apartment, and pretend this had never happened. But it was too late. She was here now, and something deep inside her whispered that this night would not end until she stepped through those doors. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her fingers trembling slightly. Then, with a deep breath, she forced herself to move. She pulled the car up the long driveway, parking just outside the front entrance. As she stepped out, the wind howled around her, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. The front door of the manor creaked open, as though it had been waiting for her, and a shiver ran down her spine. Without another thought, Mia walked into the house. The door groaned shut behind Mia with a heavy, ominous thud, sealing her inside the manor. The sound echoed through the vast, empty hall like the tolling of a distant bell. She stood frozen in the entrance, her heart racing as her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light. The house was unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that seeped into her bones and made her shiver despite the heavy coat she wore. She glanced around, her breath misting in the frigid air. The grand foyer was larger than she remembered, though that might have been her imagination. Everything about the place seemed distorted, as though the house itself had shifted over the years, twisting into something darker, more malevolent. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floor beneath her boots creaked with every step she took. A massive chandelier hung overhead, its crystal pendants dulled with dust and cobwebs, casting faint shadows that danced eerily in the flickering light of the candles mounted along the walls. But something else caught her attention. The oppressive silence. Not the kind of peaceful stillness one might expect in an abandoned house, but a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed in on her from all sides. It felt wrong, office, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As she stepped further into the foyer, she heard a noise, a low creak, almost imperceptible, like a footstep on old wood. Mia's pulse quickened as she turned, but there was nothing behind her. No one. She wasn't alone, though. She knew it. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and lean, dressed in a dark coat that billowed slightly as he moved. His sharp features were thrown into harsh relief by the dim candlelight, and his eyes glinted with a strange, unsettling light. He looked almost like a ghost himself, but when he spoke, his voice was all too human. "Are you Mia?" His tone was neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. She nodded, her throat tight. "Who are you?" "Jack," he said, offering her a thin smile. "I got the same letter. You're the first person I've seen since I got here." Mia frowned, her eyes narrowing. "How long have you been here?" "Not long," Jack replied, glancing around the dark room. "Maybe 10-15 minutes. The others should be here soon." "Others?" Jack nodded again, his expression unreadable. "6 of us in total. All invited for the same reason, I'm guessing." Mia felt a chill run down her spine. She had assumed the invitation was meant solely for her, that the house had called her back for some dark purpose connected to her past. The idea that others had been lured here as well only deepened her sense of dread. What was the connection? Why had they all been brought to this place? As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed through the foyer. Mia and Jack turned to see 3 more figures enter the room. A tall, middle-aged woman with sharp, bird-like features. A younger man, barely out of his teens, with wild, nervous eyes. And a second woman, closer to Mia's age, who looked as if she was trying to hide the fear in her expression, but failing miserably. They exchanged cautious glances, each of them clearly as confused and wary as Mia felt. "I guess we're all here for the same reason," the older woman said, her voice clipped and businesslike. She didn't bother to introduce herself, instead gesturing to the heavy oak door that led deeper into the house. "We might as well see what this Halloween haunt is all about." No one argued. They made their way into the great hall, a cavernous room lined with dust-covered furniture and ancient, moth-eaten drapes. The air smelled of mold and decay, and every step they took seemed to stir up clouds of dust that swirled in the candlelight. A large, cracked mirror hung over the mantel of a massive stone fireplace, its glass cloudy and warped, distorting their reflections into grotesque shapes. Above it, a grand portrait dominated the wall, a painting of a man with cold, piercing eyes and a cruel, thin-lipped smile. Mia felt those eyes follow her as she moved, and she quickly averted her gaze. Just as they began to gather in the center of the room, the gramophone in the corner crackled to life. Static hissed from its old brass speaker, followed by a voice, deep, hollow, and crackling with age. "Welcome to Hillridge Manor," it intoned, each word dripping with an unnatural weight. "You have been chosen to experience the haunt, a night unlike any other. You will face your darkest fears, confront the unknown, and perhaps survive." The voice paused, and Mia felt her stomach turn as the last word hung in the air. "The house will test you. It will feed on your fear. Only the strong will endure." Then, with a sputtering hiss, the gramophone fell silent. The room was plunged back into eerie stillness. No one spoke for a moment. The gravity of what they had just heard settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Mia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her mouth dry with terror. She hadn't come here to play some sick game, but it was clear now that they had no choice. Whatever was about to happen, the house had plans for them, and she doubted any of them were going to like it. Suddenly, the candles along the walls flickered, their flames dimming before snuffing out entirely. Darkness enveloped them. Panic surged through the group, and Mia heard a sharp intake of breath from the younger man. She turned toward the others, but in the pitch blackness, she could only make out vague shapes, shifting and shuffling in the dark. Her own fear threatened to choke her, but she fought to stay calm. "Everyone stay close," Jack's voice called out from somewhere nearby, steady but tense. "Don't move too far." A faint glow appeared, and Mia realized Jack had taken out a small flashlight, its weak beam barely illuminating the few feet in front of them. The others huddled around him, their faces pale and drawn. But then Mia noticed something, a change in the air, a feeling of pressure, as though the very walls were closing in on them. The shadows seemed to stretch, lengthening and deepening, until they weren't just shadows anymore. They were moving. A whisper floated through the room, faint but unmistakable, like the breath of someone standing too close. And then, just as suddenly as the lights had gone out, the candles flared back to life. Mia blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light. For a moment, everything seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. But then she realized someone was missing. Tessa, the younger woman who had been standing next to her, was gone. Panic rippled through the group. They called out her name, their voices echoing through the empty hall, but there was no response. Tessa had vanished without a sound, leaving no trace behind. One moment she had been there. The next, she was simply gone. Mia's skin crawled. The air felt heavier now, colder, as if the house itself had taken notice of their fear and was feeding on it. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, they heard it. Laughter. Cold, sharp, and laced with madness. It was Tessa's voice. Mia ran down the corridor, her heart slamming against her ribs, the walls of Hillridge Manor warping and twisting around her as if they were alive. Every hallway she entered looked the same, long, dark, lined with decaying portraits and cracked wooden floors, but none led her where she expected. It was as if the house itself had become a labyrinth, shifting its shape to trap her. The others had scattered into the darkness, their frantic voices echoing in the distance, fading as the manor swallowed them whole. The laughter, Tessa's laughter, kept trailing her like a specter, mocking her with every step. It had begun the moment Tessa disappeared, a manic cackle that rose from the depths of the house, reverberating through the walls. It wasn't Tessa anymore. Mia knew that. Whatever was laughing was something far darker, something that wore Tessa's voice like a mask. "Please," Mia whispered to herself, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. "This isn't real. It's just some kind of sick game. It has to be." But deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. The letter, the house, the sudden disappearance of Tessa, it all felt too deliberate, too calculated to be a mere prank. And the way the house shifted under her feet, the way the shadows moved, always seemed just beyond her control. She slowed her pace as she approached a door at the end of the hallway, the faintest sliver of light spilling from underneath it. She didn't recognize this part of the manor. She hadn't been here when she was a child, but she had the sinking feeling that the house was leading her somewhere on purpose. Her hand trembled as she reached for the brass knob, her fingertips brushing the cold metal. A part of her didn't want to open it. She knew that whatever was waiting on the other side wasn't going to bring her comfort, but she couldn't stop herself. She turned the knob and the door creaked open. Inside was a small study, lined with dusty bookshelves and cluttered with furniture draped in white sheets. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and rot. On the far wall, a flickering candle sat atop a heavy desk, casting long shadows across the room. And on the desk, as if waiting for her, was an old leather-bound journal. Mia hesitated at the threshold. She could feel something in the room, a presence that lingered just beyond the edge of her awareness. But the pull of the journal was stronger. Slowly, she stepped inside and approached the desk, her fingers brushing the cracked leather of the cover. The name stamped in faded gold letters on the front sent a cold shiver through her. Elias Hillridge. Her heart skipped a beat. The man from the painting in the great hall, the one with the cold, piercing eyes. This had been his journal. She flipped open the book, her breath catching as she saw the chaotic scrawl across the pages. The words were jumbled and frantic, written in a hand that seemed to deteriorate the further she read. Elias Hillridge hadn't just been the owner of this house. He had been consumed by it. The house speaks to me now. It knows what I want, what I need. I cannot leave, nor would I want to. The haunt must be fed. One by one they will join me. Their fear will sustain the house, and their souls will become part of it. Forever. The words blurred in front of Mia's eyes, a deep sense of dread filling her chest. The house was alive. It thrived on fear, on the souls of those it trapped within its walls. That was why they had been lured here. The haunt wasn't just a game, it was a ritual, and they were the sacrifices. A scraping sound made her flinch, and Mia spun around, her heart pounding. The door to the study creaked as it slowly swung shut, trapping her inside. She backed away from it, her mind racing, panic clawing at her throat. And then, from the shadows, Tessa emerged. But it wasn't really her. Her once lively eyes were now dull and lifeless, her skin pale and gaunt, as if something had drained the very life from her. She moved stiffly like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen hand, and yet her lips curled into a twisted smile, her voice soft and sing-song as she spoke. "You can't leave, Mia," Tessa whispered. "The house won't let you." Mia stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the desk for support. "Tessa, what happened to you?" Tessa's head tilted to the side, her smile widening in a way that was far too unnatural, far too wrong. "It's not me anymore. It's the house. Don't you see? It's already inside of you. It's inside all of us." Mia's blood turned to ice as she realized the truth. The house was taking them, one by one, twisting them into something unrecognizable. It was feeding on their fear, their souls, until there was nothing left but empty shells. She had to get out. Now, without thinking, she grabbed the journal and bolted for the door, but Tessa, or whatever was controlling her, blocked her path. Her eyes gleamed with dark amusement as she stepped closer, her movements jerky, inhuman. "There's no escape," Tessa sang, her voice warping into a distorted, echoing tone. "You're already part of it. The house wants you, Mia, and once it has you, you'll never leave." Mia's breath hitched as she backed away, searching frantically for another exit. Her mind raced, but her thoughts felt sluggish, as if the house was seeping into her consciousness, clouding her judgment. She couldn't let it get to her. She had to stay sharp, stay focused. In the corner of the room, behind a pile of old furniture, she spotted a window. It was small, barely large enough for her to squeeze through, but it was her only chance. Without hesitation, she ran toward it, shoving the furniture aside with all her strength. The sound of Tessa's laughter echoed behind her, growing louder, more unhinged. The house seemed to tremble around her, as though it could sense her desperation, and the floor beneath her feet creaked ominously. Mia grabbed the edge of the window, her fingers numb from the cold, and pushed it open. She could feel the air outside, cold and biting against her skin. But it was a lifeline, proof that there was still a world beyond this nightmare. But just as she began to climb through, she felt something cold and sharp wrap around her ankle. She screamed, her hands slipping on the window ledge as she struggled to free herself. But when she looked down, it wasn't Tessa holding her back. It was the floor. The wooden floorboards had split apart, and dark, shadowy tendrils had snaked out, wrapping around her leg, pulling her back into the house. The house wasn't just alive, it was sentient. It wanted her. Mia fought with everything she had, clawing at the window frame, but the tendrils were too strong. They dragged her back into the room, slamming the window shut behind her with a final, deafening thud. Tessa stood over her, her expression a grotesque mix of triumph and pity. "It's already begun, Mia. The house is part of you now. You can't fight it." But Mia wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a surge of adrenaline, she tore the journal from her coat pocket and hurled it at the shadowy tendrils. The moment it made contact, the shadows recoiled, hissing like something out of a nightmare. For a brief, terrifying moment, the house itself seemed to scream, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the walls. Mia didn't wait to see what would happen next. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding, and raced out of the study, leaving Tessa behind. The house groaned in protest as the walls seemed to close in around her, but she didn't stop running. The others had to be warned. They had to find a way out before the house claimed them all. As she stumbled through the twisting corridors, the laughter followed her, growing louder, more distorted. The house was toying with them, deceiving them at every turn. And Mia knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. The haunt had only just begun. Mia's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the endless, twisting corridors of Hillridge Manor. The house groaned and shifted around her, warping into impossible shapes, stretching itself into a monstrous thing that defied logic. The walls felt closer now, almost suffocating her, their cold, damp surface brushing against her as she ran. The laughter, Tessa's maddening laughter, followed her like a living thing, echoing off the walls, mocking her futile attempts to escape. The others were gone. Mia hadn't seen them in what felt like hours, though time itself seemed to distort within the manor's twisted halls. Jack had vanished, Karen had screamed until her voice went silent, and Mia hadn't even dared look back at the things that had once been human. They had been claimed by the house, warped, devoured, consumed by the darkness that lurked within its walls. And now it was coming for her. The tendrils of shadow that had grabbed her in the study were still there, lurking just beyond her vision, waiting for the moment she would falter. She could feel the house watching her, could sense its hunger, its desire to pull her in like it had the others. The air was thick with something foul, something alive, and Mia knew, deep in her bones, that the house was no longer just a structure. It had become a predator, and she was the prey. She rounded a corner, her feet skidding on the slick, uneven floor, and found herself in the great hall once more. The massive, cracked mirror hung above the fireplace, reflecting the room back at her in distorted, nightmarish angles. The portrait of Elias Hillridge still loomed above it, his cold, piercing eyes glinting in the dim candlelight. But something had changed. His face. It wasn't his anymore. It was hers. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the portrait. The features were unmistakable, her dark eyes, her tangled hair, her pale, frightened expression. It was her face painted in Elias Hillridge's place, a silent mockery of her struggle. The realization hit her with the force of a blow. The house wasn't just trying to trap her. It was trying to make her part of itself. Her mind reeled and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the decaying rug that lay across the floor. How had this happened? When had it happened? She had come to Hillridge Manor for answers, for closure, but instead she had been drawn into something far more insidious. The house chose you. The words from the journal echoed in her mind, Elias Hillridge's mad scribblings about the haunt, about trapping souls and feeding on fear. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a cycle. The house didn't just claim victims, it turned them into its caretakers, its watchers, its guardians. And now it had chosen her. Mia staggered toward the mirror, her hands trembling as she touched its cold surface. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed and gaunt, her expression twisted with fear and exhaustion. But beneath that fear, beneath the desperation that clawed at her, was something else. A dark, creeping sense of inevitability, of resignation. She had been fighting the house, resisting its pull, but maybe that was exactly what it wanted. Maybe that was why it had toyed with her, lured her deeper and deeper into its web of horrors. It had to break her spirit, grind her down until she had no strength left to resist. And now, looking at herself in that cracked mirror, Mia felt it, that weight. That terrible, crushing realization that there was no escape. The house had won. I'm already part of it, she thought, her stomach twisting with dread. I've been part of it from the moment I stepped inside. As if responding to her thoughts, the house groaned beneath her feet, the walls closing in, the shadows thickening. The laughter had stopped now, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on her like a vice. She could feel the house's awareness, its hunger focusing entirely on her, waiting for her to submit. Her knees buckled and Mia collapsed to the floor, her head spinning. She clutched the sides of her head, trying to silence the growing noise inside her mind, the whispers of the house seeping into her thoughts. You were always meant to be here. The house needs you. You will never leave. The words drummed in her skull, relentless, insistent, and she couldn't fight them anymore. Her strength was gone, drained by the house, by its endless games, its ceaseless horrors. She had nothing left. Her gaze drifted up to the painting one last time, her own face now staring down at her, cold and emotionless. The final realization struck her like a dagger to the heart. She was no longer a guest. She was the house. She had become the next guardian, the next watcher, just as Elias Hillridge had before her. She was trapped. Mia let out a broken sob, her hands sliding down her face as the weight of the truth crushed her. There would be no escape, no last-minute rescue. This was her fate. The house groaned again, its walls shuddering with dark satisfaction, and Mia felt the floor beneath her begin to give way. Slowly, inexorably, the shadows that had stalked her all night crept toward her, wrapping around her legs, her arms, pulling her into the depths of the manor. She didn't fight them this time. She couldn't. As the darkness closed over her, she could hear it again, that voice, so deep, so ancient. Welcome home, Mia. And then the house swallowed her whole. The wind howled through the trees outside Hillridge Manor, rustling the brittle leaves that clung to the gnarled branches. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the mansion's crumbling facade, its windows dark and hollow. Another car pulled up to the gates, headlights cutting through the fog that rolled over the grounds. A young man stepped out, clutching a letter in his trembling hands. He stared up at the imposing structure before him, his heart hammering in his chest as he reread the invitation. You are invited to the Halloween haunt. The front door creaked open just as it had for Mia, a silent, welcoming gesture. The house waited, and from the shadows within, a figure watched. Her dark eyes gleamed in the candlelight, her expression unreadable, her lips curled in a faint, knowing smile. Mia was home now, and she was waiting for the next victim. Michael Hartman's truck bounced along the uneven dirt road as he approached the Hawthorne estate. The late afternoon sky was streaked with bands of orange and purple, but it did little to soften the ominous silhouette looming in the distance. The house came into view, perched at the edge of the forest, like a forgotten relic of some bygone era. Its tall, narrow windows stared out across the landscape like darkened eyes, long blind to the world. Michael tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled in his gut since the moment Evelyn Blackwell had called him. It was just a house, another rundown property that someone with more money than sense wanted to restore. He'd done this job long enough to know that no house, no matter how derelict, could truly be haunted. It was all just bricks and wood, subject to the wear and tear of time and neglect. People made up stories to explain away creaks in the floorboards or drafts in the halls, but it was always something simple: a broken pipe, a damaged foundation, pests burrowing into the walls. That's what Michael believed. Yet, as he parked his truck in the overgrown driveway and stepped out into the cool autumn air, something felt wrong. The wind carried a strange chill that seemed to cut through his jacket, and the trees surrounding the estate swayed ominously, their branches groaning like ancient bones. He glanced at the house, taking in the sagging roof, the boarded-up windows, and the cracked stone steps leading up to the front door. He had seen worse, but something about this place made his skin prickle. Michael took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was there. He was a professional. Evelyn had hired him to do a thorough inspection before she began the restoration. The house had sat abandoned for years, left to decay and gather dust, and it was his job to figure out just how much damage had been done. He wasn't here to entertain ghost stories. He was here to do a job. Pulling his tool bag from the back of his truck, he made his way toward the front door. As he approached, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, hanging loosely on its rusted hinges. That was odd. He had expected the place to be locked up tight. He hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open with a soft creak. The sound echoed through the vast empty foyer beyond, bouncing off the high ceilings and disappearing into the shadows. The air inside was stale and thick with dust, and the scent of mildew hung heavy in the air. He stepped inside, feeling the wooden floor creak beneath his weight, and took a quick look around. The house was even more dilapidated than he'd expected. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the wallpaper peeled away from the walls in long, curling strips. Faded portraits of grim-faced men and women lined the walls, their eyes seemingly watching him as he moved further inside. Michael suppressed a shiver. In the center of the foyer, a grand staircase curved upward, its banister chipped and worn. Dust motes floated lazily in the thin slivers of light, filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The house was silent except for the faint groaning of the wind outside and the soft creaks of the old floorboards beneath his feet. He pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The light caught something on the far wall, a note pinned to the peeling wallpaper with a rusty nail. Michael frowned and moved closer, shining his light on the yellowing paper. "Inspect thoroughly. Check every corner. Don't miss the basement." The handwriting was elegant, almost too neat, and there was no signature. He assumed it was from Evelyn, but something about the wording felt off. Inspect thoroughly? That went without saying. It was his job. And the basement? Why emphasize that? He shrugged the thought away. It didn't matter. The note was probably just Evelyn's way of making sure he did a good job. She seemed the type to be meticulous. Michael pocketed the note and made his way through the house, starting with the ground floor. He moved methodically from room to room, jotting down notes about the condition of the structure and the various repairs that would be needed. Every room had the same unsettling stillness to it, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In the kitchen, he found an old stove and rusted plumbing that would need to be replaced. In the dining room, the windows had been shattered, their jagged edges framed by rotting wood. The dining table was still there, covered in a thick layer of dust, with the remains of a long-forgotten meal scattered across its surface. Plates and silverware laid out as though someone had simply walked away and never returned. As he worked, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was never anyone there. It was just his nerves getting the better of him, he told himself. Old houses had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The silence, the shadows, it all fed into the human tendency to imagine things that weren't there. But even as he tried to convince himself of that, the sense of unease only deepened. By the time he made his way to the second floor, the light outside had faded to dusk, and the house had grown colder. The temperature drop was sudden and severe, and Michael found himself shivering as he climbed the stairs. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the entire hallway was plunged into darkness. He slapped the side of the flashlight, cursing under his breath as the light sputtered back to life. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring down the long hallway. The doors to the various rooms were closed, but there was one at the end of the hall that was slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out from the crack, flickering as though from a dying bulb. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't turned on any lights. As far as he knew, there was no electricity running to the house yet. He took a deep breath and started toward the door. With every step, the whispers of doubt in his mind grew louder. Maybe this wasn't just an ordinary inspection. Maybe there was something else going on here, something he couldn't explain. When he reached the door, he paused. The air was cold, almost frigid now, and his breath puffed out in small clouds before him. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a small bedroom, sparsely furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a single chair by the window. The wallpaper here was torn and faded, but there was something else, something that made his skin crawl. A mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed, its surface dusty and cracked. But in the dim light, Michael saw something in the reflection that made his blood run cold. There was a figure standing behind him, barely visible in the shadows, its outline distorted and strange. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but the room was empty. The house groaned, its ancient bones creaking as the wind outside howled through the cracks. Michael took a step back, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just seen. He turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. It was just his imagination. It had to be. But deep down, Michael knew something was very, very wrong with this house. Michael stood frozen in the center of the small bedroom, the memory of the shadowy figure in the mirror etched into his mind like a scar. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he tried to calm his racing heart, but it was no use. The room felt wrong, oppressive, almost suffocating, and no amount of logical reasoning could shake the feeling that something unnatural had just occurred. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to push the fear aside. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself. Maybe the cracked mirror had distorted his reflection, and his tired eyes had seen something that wasn't there. It wasn't the first time an old house had played tricks on him. He was exhausted from the long day and spooked by the decaying structure. That had to be it. And yet the cold in the room was undeniable. His breath still fogged before him, and the air felt dense and heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on him. He quickly jotted down some notes just to keep his hands busy, then turned and left the bedroom. The feeling of being watched followed him out into the hallway. As Michael descended the staircase, the house seemed to groan in protest beneath his weight. Each step was a creak, a sigh, as if the very walls of the house were alive and aware of his presence. The dim light from his flashlight wavered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch out, grasping at the corners of his vision. He shook off the sensation and continued his inspection, trying to focus on the task at hand. But no matter where he went, that eerie sense of being observed lingered. And then the whispers began. At first, they were barely perceptible, a soft rustling that could have been the wind slipping through the cracked windows. Michael barely registered it, absorbed in his work as he inspected the state of the plumbing in the kitchen. He crouched by the old sink, shining his light into the dark recesses of the cabinetry, when he heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. Words. Michael straightened slowly, his ears straining to pick up the noise. It was so quiet that it could have been mistaken for the house settling, or the distant howl of the wind through the forest outside. But as he stood there holding his breath, the sound grew more distinct. Soft, murmured voices, barely audible but undeniably human. He swept his flashlight across the kitchen, scanning every corner, but there was nothing there. The whispers faded, retreating back into the silence of the old house, and Michael exhaled shakily. His nerves were getting the better of him, he reasoned. It had been a long day, and he was jumpy. But as he moved on to the dining room, the whispers returned. This time they were closer, just on the edge of his hearing. They drifted around him like voices carried on a breeze, too low to make out clearly but unmistakably there. Michael stopped dead in his tracks, his skin crawling. He turned slowly, his flashlight illuminating the dining room in pale, wavering light. The room was empty, just as it had been when he'd first walked through it. The air was still. The house was still. But the whispers, they were persistent. "Hello?" he called out, the sound of his voice strange and hollow in the emptiness of the house. The whispers ceased immediately, leaving behind a ringing silence that made his ears throb. He waited, his muscles tense, but no one answered. He swallowed hard and shook his head, feeling foolish for calling out into an empty house. No one was here. It was an old house, probably just the wind getting through the walls, he thought again, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't about to let some creaks and whispers spook him into abandoning the job. Evelyn was paying good money for this inspection, and he wasn't going to let some old house get under his skin. But as he moved through the house, room by room, the whispers continued. They seemed to follow him, always just beyond the range of understanding, like fragments of conversations that had been cut off mid-sentence. The voices were low and indistinct, but sometimes he thought he caught a word, just a single syllable that sent a shiver down his spine. He could never quite make out what they were saying, but they were there, and the whispers weren't alone. As Michael moved through the house, he began to catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows darting just at the edge of his vision, quick and fleeting. He would turn, expecting to find something, a rat maybe, or a branch tapping against the window, but there was nothing. Only the empty rooms, the silent walls, and the suffocating darkness. It was as though the house itself was alive, its very essence seeping into his mind, twisting his thoughts. The once strong walls felt brittle now, like they were held together by the weight of secrets buried deep in the past. He couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was hiding just behind the crumbling plaster, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Michael's flashlight flickered again, and he cursed under his breath, giving it a sharp tap. The light flared back to life, casting sharp, angular shadows against the walls. He had been through enough old houses to know that bad wiring and faulty fixtures were par for the course, but tonight, every flicker, every shadow seemed more sinister. He forced himself to keep moving, but the house resisted his presence at every turn. The whispers grew louder, though still unintelligible, and with them came a mounting sense of dread. Each time he stepped into a new room, the walls seemed to close in on him, as if the house were shrinking around him, forcing him deeper into its bowels. Finally, he reached the basement door. It loomed before him like the mouth of a cave, yawning open, waiting. Michael stood there for a moment, staring at the door, feeling a cold sweat break out across his skin. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him in a cacophony of voices that seemed to be urging him forward, beckoning him to descend into the depths. He didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, to leave the house, to run. But the note Evelyn had left flashed through his mind. Don't miss the basement. With a deep breath, Michael grasped the door handle and pulled it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the air that wafted up from the basement was even colder than the rest of the house, damp and musty, with a faint, almost metallic tang that made his stomach churn. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, barely wide enough for him to walk comfortably. His flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness below, and the whispers seemed to swell as he took his first step down. They weren't faint anymore. They were all around him now, surrounding him, enveloping him. Keep going, they seemed to say. Don't stop. Come closer. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he descended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cold seeped into his bones, and the oppressive air made it hard to breathe. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him from above, as if it were watching his every move. When he finally reached the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a large open space. The basement was unfinished, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating old wooden beams and rusted metal piping that crisscrossed overhead. The air was thick with the scent of decay. But there was something else down here, too. Something that didn't belong. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden by shadows, was a small padlocked door. It was old and worn, its surface covered in layers of dust and grime. But the lock was new, gleaming silver against the dull wood. Michael frowned. This door hadn't been on the blueprints Evelyn had given him. The whispers surged again, louder now, almost frantic. They were no longer just background noise. They were a constant presence, hissing and murmuring in his ears, urging him to open the door. Michael hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave, to get out of this house before something happened that he couldn't explain, couldn't undo. But he couldn't ignore the door, couldn't ignore the way the whispers seemed to converge on it, as though everything in the house had led him here. His hands trembled as he reached for his crowbar. The lock snapped open easily, and the door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a narrow stairwell that led even deeper into the earth. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had a sinking feeling that whatever waited for him down there wasn't something he was meant to find. The stairwell stretched into a void of darkness, the steps worn and slick beneath Michael's boots. He hesitated at the top, staring into the abyss below, gripping the doorframe as though it might pull him back into safety. The whispers, now almost a constant hum in his ears, grew louder, insistent and demanding, their incomprehensible words coiling around his thoughts like tendrils of smoke. The air was heavier here, thick with a smell that reminded him of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. Michael steeled himself, his knuckles white as he gripped his flashlight tighter. He could feel it now, pressing against the edges of his mind. A presence that didn't belong in this world, waiting for him at the bottom of those steps. It felt ancient and restless, a hunger that had been left unsatisfied for far too long. But something else pushed him forward, something darker, buried deep within him. It wasn't just curiosity or stubbornness. No, it was the whispers. They wanted him to come. The wooden stairs creaked beneath his weight as he descended into the depths of the house, each step echoing in the hollow space below. The walls around him were rough stone, cold and slick to the touch, and the further he went, the colder it became. The light from his flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, casting weak beams across the stone walls and uneven steps. He wasn't sure how long he had been descending. Time seemed to warp here, stretching and distorting, until it felt as though he had been walking for hours. But finally, the stairwell opened into a small underground chamber, carved out of the earth itself. His flashlight flickered, sputtering in the damp air before settling into a weak but steady beam. Michael stepped off the final stair and into the chamber. The whispers were deafening now, so loud that they felt as if they were inside his skull, hammering against the walls of his mind. He tried to block them out, but it was no use. They had a rhythm now, a cadence, their voices twining together like a dark chant that he couldn't escape. He swept the flashlight across the chamber. It was small, no more than 20 feet across, with low, arched ceilings that barely cleared his head. The stone walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and sigils that looked ancient, etched deep into the rock. Some were familiar, others entirely alien, but they all gave off a feeling of wrongness, like they didn't belong in this world. And there, in the center of the room, was the altar. It was crude, made of dark stone and covered in dust and debris, but there was something unmistakably sinister about it. The top of the altar was carved with more symbols, and resting on it was an old, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and worn, the leather darkened with age, or perhaps something else. Michael didn't want to think about it. Surrounding the altar were dozens of photographs, their edges curling with age, yellowed and brittle. He recognized them instantly. They were the same faces from the portraits upstairs. But there was something more. In each of the photographs behind the figures was a dark shape, a shadowy figure barely visible but unmistakably present. It loomed over them, distorted and monstrous, and no matter how he tried to focus on it, its shape never fully resolved. It was as if the figure was shifting, its form never quite settling into something Michael could comprehend. Michael's heart raced as he knelt to pick up one of the photos, his hand trembling. The figure seemed to pulse with malevolence, even in the still image, and the air around him thickened as though it were alive. He knew instinctively that this shadow, this thing, was connected to the whispers, to the house itself. He felt its presence all around him, watching, waiting. Against his better judgment, Michael reached for the book on the altar. As his fingers brushed the cracked leather, a sudden wave of nausea washed over him. The whispers surged in his ears, their chanting more frantic now, more desperate. It was as if the house was pleading with him, begging him not to open the book. But something inside him, a compulsion he couldn't explain, drove him to ignore the warning. He flipped open the cover, revealing pages covered in symbols and drawings, each one more grotesque than the last. They depicted strange, twisted figures, creatures with too many limbs and faces that seemed to melt and shift on the page. There were rituals described in languages he couldn't understand, words that twisted his tongue even as he read them silently in his mind. But one drawing stopped him cold. It was the house. The Hawthorne estate was sketched in painstaking detail, its windows dark and empty, its roof sagging under the weight of time. But beneath the house, drawn in darker ink, was something else, something buried deep beneath the foundation. It was a figure, chained and bound, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its face was blank, a featureless expanse that seemed to stare back at him from the page. Michael's breath caught in his throat. His fingers traced the drawing, his mind racing to make sense of it. Was this Was this place a prison? Was this house built to contain whatever this thing was? He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the drawing was the same presence he had felt since he first stepped into the house, the same shadow he had glimpsed in the photographs and in the mirror upstairs. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a suffocating, absolute silence, as though the house itself had taken a deep breath and was holding it, waiting. Michael felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He slowly rose to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears, his gaze fixed on the altar. Something had changed. The air in the chamber grew colder still, and in the dim light of his flashlight, Michael saw it, a shadow shifting in the far corner of the room. It was barely more than a ripple in the darkness, but it moved with purpose, sliding along the stone walls like a living thing. It grew larger, its form elongating and distorting until it stood as tall as the chamber would allow. Michael's hand tightened around the flashlight as the shadow stepped into the light. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its body too thin. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. And yet, Michael could feel its gaze as though it were staring straight through him, piercing him to his core. The room seemed to warp around the creature, the stone walls bending inward, closing in. Michael stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to get away from the thing. But the chamber was small, and there was nowhere to run. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The whispers returned, not from the walls, but from inside his own mind, twisting, spiraling, feeding on his fear. The light from his flashlight flickered, then died, plunging the chamber into complete darkness. Michael's heart raced as he fumbled with the flashlight, desperate to get it working again. But even in the darkness, he could feel the presence of the thing closing in on him, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. He could hear the faint sound of breathing, labored and uneven, though he wasn't sure if it was his own or the creature's. And then, without warning, the ground beneath him shifted. It was as if the very earth was moving, rising up to meet him. Michael staggered, his foot catching on something slick, and he fell hard to the floor. His hand scraped against the stone, and he felt something wet and sticky beneath his fingers. He shone the dim light of his failing flashlight on his hand and saw it, dark, glistening blood smeared across his palm. Panicked, he scrambled to his feet, but the figure was there, blocking his path. Its presence filled the chamber, its form towering over him. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot, and Michael's stomach twisted in revulsion. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the walls seemed to close in, the chamber shrinking around him, trapping him with the creature. The whispers filled his mind now, drowning out all rational thought. They weren't just words, they were feelings, emotions, memories that weren't his own. They overwhelmed him, suffocated him, until he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and the house's influence began. With one final burst of adrenaline, Michael broke free from the creature's shadow and bolted for the stairs. He didn't look back. He couldn't. His feet pounded against the stone steps as he raced upward, the darkness closing in behind him like a wave. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was angry that he was leaving. When he finally burst through the door at the top of the stairwell, slamming it shut behind him, the silence was deafening. Michael leaned against the basement door, gasping for air as the heavy wood pressed against his back. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat reverberating in his skull like the pounding of a drum. The silence on the other side of the door was unbearable. He wanted to believe he was safe now, that the house had let him go, but deep down he knew better. The house wasn't done with him yet. The whispers had followed him all the way up the stairs, echoing in his mind like a relentless chorus. Even now they lingered in the back of his thoughts, soft but insistent, threading themselves through his every breath. The cold that had permeated the air in the chamber below had clung to him, a biting chill that refused to release its grip. He pushed himself off the door and stumbled down the hallway, his legs trembling beneath him. The house felt different now, quieter, yes, but there was something more. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, as though they had taken on a will of their own, stretching out along the walls and ceiling in grotesque shapes. The air was heavy with a sense of expectation, and every creak, every groan of the old wood beneath his feet felt purposeful, like the house was guiding him somewhere. Michael's vision swam, the edges of his consciousness fraying as exhaustion and terror warred for control. He needed to get out. He needed to leave this place behind before it consumed him entirely. He stumbled toward the front door, his eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight spilling in through the cracks between the boards covering the windows. The outside world seemed so far away now, as though it belonged to another life entirely. His fingers closed around the cold brass of the front door handle, and for a moment, his heart lifted. Freedom. He was so close. He turned the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. He rattled it violently, throwing his weight against it, but it remained firmly shut, as though some invisible force was holding it closed. "No," he whispered, panic creeping into his voice. "No. No. No." He pulled at the door with every ounce of strength he had left, but it was no use. The house wouldn't let him go. Despair washed over him and he staggered back, his hands shaking as he stared at the immovable door. The whispers began to rise again, louder now, filling the house with their sinister chant. They seemed almost gleeful, as though the house had been toying with him all along, letting him believe he could escape only to snatch it away at the last moment. He turned, his back pressed against the door, his eyes scanning the hallway for another way out. But the shadows had deepened, thickened, swirling around him like a living thing. They crawled along the floor, slithering toward him with slow, deliberate purpose. And in those shadows he could see them. Figures, tall and gaunt, their faces blank and featureless like the creature from the basement. They moved closer, their limbs too long, too thin, their presence pressing in on him from every side. "Stop!" Michael shouted, but the figures didn't slow. The whispers swelled, almost deafening now, as if they were coming from the figures themselves. The shadows twisted and writhed around their forms, distorting them until they were nothing more than dark blurs, impossible to define but unmistakably menacing. His thoughts were unraveling. Panic clawed at his mind, pulling him deeper into the grip of the house. He could feel it, its ancient will wrapping itself around him, digging its claws into his psyche. The house didn't want to kill him. No, it wanted something far worse. It wanted him to surrender, to belong to it, just like the others before him. He remembered the photographs, the faces of the people who had lived here long ago, those cold, unsmiling faces staring out from faded prints. They had been consumed by the house, trapped within its walls for eternity. And now it was his turn. The basement. The thought came unbidden, a sharp intrusion into his terror. The basement had been more than just a chamber. It had been a a prison for whatever that thing was. The house wasn't just a place, it was a vessel, a living, breathing thing designed to contain something ancient and malevolent, something that had reached out to him through the whispers. But maybe, just maybe, if he could seal it again. His body moved on instinct, driven by a single desperate hope. He turned away from the front door and bolted down the hallway, back toward the basement stairs. The air seemed to grow thicker with every step, the walls closing in on him, the house resisting his movement as though it were trying to hold him back. But Michael pushed forward, adrenaline coursing through his veins, his mind fixed on the only plan he had left. The basement door swung open with a deafening creak, revealing the dark stairwell below. The cold hit him like a physical blow, seeping into his bones, but he forced himself to keep moving. His flashlight had long since died, but the faint glow of the moonlight through the boarded windows provided just enough light to guide his steps. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps as he approached the altar, his mind racing for a solution. He grabbed the book, flipping through its pages, searching for something, anything that could help him. The symbols and drawings blurred before his eyes, their meanings lost to him in his frantic state. And then, there it was, a page near the end of the book, marked with a symbol that matched the one carved into the altar. The text beneath the symbol was written in a language he couldn't understand, but he knew that this was it. This was the key. The whispers swirled around him, rising to a deafening crescendo, as though the house was trying to drown out his thoughts. The shadows pressed in, the figures looming closer, their faceless heads turned toward him, watching, waiting. Michael placed his hand on the symbol carved into the altar, his fingers trembling. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He wasn't even sure if this would work, but he had no other choice. He began to speak, his voice low and uncertain, trying to mimic the strange words written in the book. The sounds felt foreign on his tongue, harsh and guttural, but he forced himself to keep going. As the last word left his lips, the air around him seemed to shift. The shadows recoiled, pulling back toward the walls, and the figures paused, their movements stuttering as though something had interrupted their advance. For a moment, everything was still. And then, with a sudden rush of force, the room exploded with sound. The whispers turned into screams, terrified, desperate screams that echoed through the chamber. The air vibrated with energy, and Michael felt a surge of power radiating from the altar, pushing against him like a tidal wave. The figures in the shadows began to dissolve, their forms unraveling like smoke caught in a gust of wind. The darkness around him thinned, and Michael felt the oppressive weight of the house begin to lift. The presence that had been pressing against his mind retreated, pulled back into the depths of the house where it belonged. It was working, but then, just as quickly as it had begun, the power receded. The screams faded, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. The shadows still clung to the walls, no longer animated but still present, like stains that couldn't be scrubbed away. The air grew cold again, colder than before, and Michael's heart sank. The house wasn't done. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he realized his mistake. He hadn't sealed it. He had awakened it. Whatever force he had tried to contain was no longer just a passive presence. It was awake now, fully aware of him, and it was angry. The walls began to shake, the very foundation of the house trembling as though the earth itself were quaking beneath him. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming into something new, something darker. And in that moment, Michael understood. There was no escape. The house would never let him go. Not truly. Michael's legs buckled beneath him as the realization washed over him. The weight of it was too much to bear. He had come so close to breaking free. But the house had always been one step ahead. It had been toying with him, leading him down this path, knowing all along that he would never truly leave. And now, as the darkness closed in, Michael felt a strange sense of acceptance settle over him. He had fought, he had run, but in the end the house had won. He could feel it now seeping into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a shroud. The whispers grew softer, more soothing, as though the house were comforting him, lulling him into submission. His body relaxed and he let out a slow, shuddering breath. The fear that had gripped him for so long melted away, replaced by a strange calm. The house was no longer his enemy. It was a part of him now, and he was a part of it. He had no choice but to embrace it. As the last of the light faded from the room, Michael closed his eyes. The whispers were no longer voices in the walls. They were inside him now, filling the empty spaces of his mind, their presence warm and comforting. And in the silence that followed, the house breathed a long, satisfied sigh. The door upstairs clicked open, but no one was there to walk through it.